Hi, Aqua Roomers. Time for chapter reading. We were reading about Ma making hulled corn, where she has to wash and scrub every ear of corn. She even has to take the outer skin off of every single kernel. It's a lot of hard work. But Laura loves hulled corn. When every skin was loose and peeling, Ma lugged the heavy kettle outdoors. She filled a clean wash tub with cold water from the spring, and she dipped the corn out of the kettle into the tub. Then she rolled the sleeves of her flower dress above her elbows, and she knelt by the tubs. With her hands, she rubbed and scrubbed the corn until the hulls came off and floated on top of the water. Often, she poured the water off, filled the tub again with the buckets of water from the spring. She kept on rubbing and scrubbing the corn between her hands and changing the water until every hull came off and was washed away. Ma looked pretty with her bare arms, her cheeks so red, her dark hair smooth and shining, while she scrubbed and rubbed the corn in the clear water. She never splashed one drop of water on her pretty dress. When at last the corn was done, Ma put all the soft white kernels in a big jar in the pantry. Then at last they had hulled corn and milk for supper. Sometimes they had hulled corn for breakfast with maple syrup. And sometimes Ma fried the soft kernels in pork drippings. Fried corn, oh. But Laura liked them best with milk. Autumn was great fun. There was so much work to do and so many good things to eat, so many new things to see. Laura was scampering and chattering like the squirrels from morning to night. One frosty morning, a machine came up the road. 4 horses were pulling it, and 2 men were on it. The horses hauled it up into the field where Pa and Uncle Henry and Grandpa and Mr. Peterson had stacked their wheat. 2 more men drove after it another, smaller machine. Pa called to Ma that the threshers had come. Then he hurried out to the field with his team. Laura and Mary asked Ma, and then they ran out to the field after him. They might watch if they were careful not to get in the way. Now, this is the threshing machine. So the horses trot in a circle, and there's the fella who directs the horses. And then that makes this long rod turn, and it turns the machine. Oh, I think that's Laura and Mary. They're watching. Yeah. Uncle Henry came riding up and tied his horse to a tree. Then he and Pa hitched all the other horses, 8 of them, to the smaller machine. They hitched each team to the end of a long stick that came out from the center of the machine, that rod that went across the bottom. A long iron rod lay on the ground from this machine to the big machine. Afterward, Laura and Mary asked questions, and Pa told them that the big machine was called the separator, and the rod was called the tumbling rod, and the little machine was called the horsepower. 8 horses were hitched to it and made it go. So this was an 8 horsepower machine. A man sat on top of the horsepower, and when everything was ready, he clucked the horses, and they began to go. They walked around him in a circle, each team pulling on the long stick to which it was hitched and following the team ahead. Look at one more time. So this is an 8 horsepower machine. Do you know that the cars that we drive are typically 8 horsepower? Some 6 horsepower? So we still use that term. But it really came from horses. They stepped carefully over the tumbling rod, the horses, which was tumbling over and over on the ground. Then their pulling made the tumbling rod keep rolling over, and the rod moved the machinery of the separator, which stood beside the stack of wheat. All this machinery made an enormous racket, rackety bang and clanging. Laura and Mary held tight to each other at the edge of the field, and they watched with all their eyes. They had never seen a machine before. They had never heard such a racket. Pa and Uncle Henry, on top of the wheat stack, were pitching bundles down onto a board. A man stood at the board, cut the bands on the bundles, and crowded the bundles one at a time into the hole at the end of the separator. Remember the bundles of wheat that Pa and Uncle Henry put together when they were with Uncle Charlie, Cousin Charlie to help? The tall ones. So bundle to bundle, they put it in. The hole looked like the separator's mouth, and it had long iron teeth. The teeth were chewing. They chewed the bundles, and the separator swallowed them. Straw blew out of the separator's other end, and wheat poured out of its side. 2 men were working fast, trampling the straw and building it into a sack. 1 man was working fast, sacking the pouring grain. The grains of wheat poured out of the separator into a half-bushel measure. And as fast as the measure filled, the man slipped an empty sack into its place and emptied the full one. He just had time to empty it and slip it back under the spout before another measure ran over. All the men were working as fast as they possibly could, but the machine kept right up with them. Laura and Mary were so excited they could hardly breathe. They held hands tightly and stared. The horses walked round and around. The man who was driving them cracked his whip and shouted, "Giddy up there, John. No use trying to shirk." Crack went the whip. "Careful there, Billy. Easy, boy. You can't go so fast nohow." The separator swallowed the bundles. The golden straw blew out in a golden cloud. The wheat streamed golden brown out of the spout while the men hurried. Pa and Uncle Henry pitched bundles down as fast as they could, and the chaff and the dust blew everything. Laura and Mary watched as long as they could. Then they ran back to the house to help Ma get dinner for all those men. A big kettle of cabbage and meat was boiling on the stove. A big pan of beans and a Johnny cake were baking in the oven. Laura and Mary set the table for the threshers. They put on salt-rising bread and butter, beans, pumpkin, bowls of stewed pumpkin, pies, dried berry pies, cookies, cheese, and honey, and pitchers of milk. Wow. And then Ma put on the boiled potatoes and cabbage and meat, the baked beans, the hot Johnny cake, and the baked Hubbard squash, and she poured the tea. Laura always wondered why bread made of cornmeal was called Johnny cake. It wasn't cake. Ma didn't know unless the northern soldiers called it Johnny cake because the people in the South where they fought ate so much of it. It's cornbread. They called the Southern soldiers Johnny Rebs. Maybe they called the Southern cornbread cake just for fun. Ma had heard some say that it should be called journey cake. She didn't know it wouldn't be very good bread to take on a journey. As soon as the threshers came in to the table, loaded with food, there was none too much, for threshers work hard and get very hungry. By the middle of the afternoon, the machines had finished all the threshing, and the men who owned them drove them away into the big woods, taking with them their sacks of wheat that were their pay. They were going to the next place where neighbors had stacked their wheat and wanted the machines to thresh it. So you didn't need money. People paid with food. They paid with things that they were able to do in exchange for work. So the threshers got wheat. That's what they wanted. Pa was very tired that night, but he was happy, and he said to Ma, "It would have taken Uncle Henry and Peterson and Pa and me a couple of weeks apiece to thresh as much grain as that machine threshed today. We wouldn't have got as much wheat either, and it wouldn't have been as clean. That machine's a great invention," he said. "Other folks can stick to old-fashioned ways if they want to, but I'm all for progress. It's a great age that we're living in. As long as I raise wheat, I'm going to have a machine come and thresh it, if there's one anywhere in the neighborhood." He was too tired that night to talk to Laura, but Laura was proud of him. It was Pa who got the other men to stack their wheat together and send for the threshing machine, and it was a wonderful machine. Everybody was glad that it had come. So, my goodness, this is the last chapter of the book, and it's called The Deer in the Wood. So we'll start this one. And boys and girls, when we finish this book tomorrow, I have some things to tell you, because my grandmother grew up in a log house just like Laura and Mary, and I have a picture of it. I've got lots of stories to tell you, okay? The Deer in the Wood. The grass was dry and withered, and the cows must be taken out of the woods and kept in the barn to be fed. All the bright-colored leaves became dull brown when the cold fall rains began. There was no more playing under the trees, but Pa was in the house when it rained, and he began again to play the fiddle after supper. And then the rain stopped. The weather grew colder. In the early mornings, everything sprinkled with frost. The days were growing short, and the little fire burned all day in the cook stove to keep the house warm. Winter was not far away. The attic and the cellar were full of good things once more, and Laura and Mary had started to make patchwork quilts. Everything was beginning to be snug and cozy again. So we will finish the book tomorrow, and I will have some stories of my grandmother and my log house to tell you about, okay? So until next time, boys and girls, tomorrow, you're not going to want to miss it. Bye.